Lot 1, I will say 400,000 to start this, 400,000's bid at 400,000, 450,000, 450,000, 500,000, 550,000, 600,000, 650,000, 700,000 and 50, 800,000 and 50, 850,000, at 900,000, at 900,000, at 900,000, 950,000, 1 million, at 1 million pounds, any more? At 1 million pounds here, at 1 million pounds, any more? At 1 million pounds.
This is one of the grandest, the most spectacular books of modern times. It contains 435 plates, each measuring 27 inches by 40 inches, a size printers call double elephant folio. Less than 200 complete sets were printed, yet it's one of the most influential bird books ever produced, bringing such fame to its author that his name is today in the United States synonymous with natural history and conservation. The man who produced that book, John James Audubon, was born just 200 years ago in 1785. In 1804, he arrived here at Mill Grove, an estate near Philadelphia in the United States of America. He was a handsome young man, a bit of a dandy with a taste for frilled shirts and satin pants. He spoke with a thick French accent, and he was a bit vague about his origins. He dropped hints every now and again that he might be the long-lost Crown Prince of France, the son of Queen Marie Antoinette, and he habitually exaggerated his age. In fact, he was 19, the illegitimate son of a French sea captain and a lady of French extraction living on the island of Haiti, where he was born. When he was 4, his father took him back to France, and there, at Nantes, he was mothered by Captain Audubon's legitimate wife. His father had bought this 200-acre property as an investment. It was not just a farm, there was also a mill and a disused lead mine, but he had never lived here. The place was being managed by an agent. Clearly his son, and this is one of the earliest portraits we have of him, could take it over as soon as he learned the business. But young Jean-Jacques, or John James as he now called himself, showed little interest in either farming or mining. He was much more interested in hunting and shooting. In particular, he was fascinated by the birds. The Canada geese that came to the stream below the house must have already been familiar to him, for the species had been domesticated in France for centuries. But many others were totally new and spectacularly beautiful. He hunted them with zeal. He was apparently an excellent shot, and began to assemble a collection of every species on the property. In this attic room, he created his own museum. He had birds' eggs threaded on strings around the walls, birds' nests and stuffed mammals and birds of all kinds, every one of which he had shot and skinned and mounted himself. But as well as collecting dead specimens, he also studied very intensively the living animals themselves. Phoebes, a kind of flycatcher, nest in the riverbanks and under the eaves of this house, then as now. The fact that they had flown up from their wintering grounds in the south was well known, but Audubon wondered whether the same individual birds returned to the same nest site each year. So he devised a simple experiment. He took the nestlings just before they flew and bound silver threads loosely around their legs. By marking them in this way, he was able to prove that the young birds do indeed return each year. and so he became one of the earliest to use this now well-established technique of bird banding or ringing. He also painted the birds in watercolour. He had always had a taste for painting, and as a boy in France had even had lessons from the great classical painter Jacques-Louis David. To judge from the few drawings that survived from this time, his talent was not particularly remarkable. He drew them, as was customary then, in static, somewhat lifeless poses. But he became increasingly dissatisfied with such pictures. He wanted to show his birds flying and feeding and fighting as he saw them doing in the woods around the house. But that was not easy. Nobody else had produced such drawings that he could copy. He had no binoculars to study the birds' postures in detail, no camera to freeze their movements, no field guides to educate his eye. Then he hit upon a solution. He would draw the specimens he shot before he skinned and stuffed them. The first he treated in this way was a kingfisher. To begin with, he gave the limp body some rigidity by piercing it with wire.
I fixed the bird on a board. Wires and pins held the head in a pretty fair attitude. Others fixed the feet according to my notions. The last wire proved a delightful elevator to the bird's tail. The many foreshortenings were rendered attainable by means of squares of equal dimensions affixed both to my drawing paper and immediately behind the subject before me. I then copied the bird with a closeness of measurement that I hope will always correspond with nature.
So, suddenly, a new vivacity appeared in his drawings as he recreated, using dead bodies, the attitudes of the living creatures. The squares on the board behind them and on his paper enabled him to draw the birds exactly life-size, and that was to become an obsession with him. The neighbouring property, a quarter of a mile away from here, Fatland Ford, was a little grander than Mill Grove. It belonged to a family of English immigrants, the Bakewells, and their eldest daughter, Lucy, 3 years younger than Audubon, eventually caught his eye. And 3 years after they met, they became engaged to be married. But Audubon was not getting on well with his father's agent, and eventually he sold his interest in this property. And then he teamed up with a Frenchman newly arrived in the country, a little older than he was, called Ferdinand Rosier. And leaving his newly acquired fiancée behind, he and Rosier set off westwards across the Allegheny Mountains to look for business on the American frontier. For the next 10 years, he tried to earn a living as a trader and storekeeper along the Ohio. The country was still wild and largely empty. Towns were then only just beginning to grow. Cincinnati on the North Shore with its river traffic. And Louisville at the falls of the Ohio, a town favored by French immigrants. Farther down the river, many of the settlements, such as Henderson, that today are thriving towns, were nothing but empty plots marked on a map and a few dozen cabins, like this great log house where Audubon stayed for quite a while. In 1812, he proudly became an American citizen and took to the frontier life, its customs and music with gusto. It was from communities such as these that he hoped to make a living. The stores that he and Rosier set up must have been very much like this one. They sold pretty well everything you can think of, from locally grown produce like tobacco and home-cured hams and whiskey, to imported materials, guns, pots and pans, gunpowder, sugar, and so on. They charged many times more than any particular object cost them, but the difficulty was, as Audubon himself said, was there simply not enough customers in these small frontier towns. Again and again the store failed, and again he and Rosier moved on to try their luck elsewhere. Audubon and Lucy Bakewell had now married, and Lucy had borne him 4 children, though only 2 sons survived. Lucy, throughout this time, endured a great deal and was much put upon. She loyally provided capital from her inheritance for her husband's commercial ventures and earned extra money by teaching local children. Audubon, on the other hand, neglected her and his business in favour of wandering through the woods, looking for birds, and obsessively adding new paintings of new species to his bulging folios. When it came to shooting, he claimed that he was given tips by no less an expert than Daniel Boone with his Kentucky rifle.
I shot the 2 little birds here, represented near the village of Henderson in 1811. They were both busily engaged, searching for insects along the branches and amongst the leaves of a dogwood tree. Not having met with any other individuals of this species, I am at this moment unable to say anything more about them.
Neither can anyone else, for sure, for no one has since seen anything exactly like them. Audubon called them the carbonated warbler. It's just possible that they were a species on the verge of extinction that soon afterwards disappeared altogether.
Pursuing the great horned owl, I suddenly found myself sunk in quicksand up to my armpits, and in this condition must have remained to perish had not my boatman come up and extricated me. I relate this occurrence, and it is only one out of many, to show you that every student of nature must encounter some difficulties in obtaining the object of his research, although his difficulties are little thought of when he has succeeded.
So, assiduously, he built up a collection of life-size drawings of the birds he loved so much. One day in 1810, an awkward, ungainly stranger walked into the Audubon store, which at that time was in the infant town of Louisville. He was a Scot, his name was Alexander Wilson, and he had written and published verse rather in the style of his contemporary and compatriot Robert Burns. But much more importantly, he was an ornithologist, an artist, and an author. And he brought with him a copy of his book, this. It was the first volume of what was to be a 9-volume set, which would amount to be the first illustrated systematic account of the birds of North America. He was looking for subscriptions. He wanted $120 for the set. Audubon, perhaps unusually, was actually in the store at the time, and he was about to subscribe when his partner Rosier, who was sitting over by the desk, muttered to him in French, saying, "Why subscribe? His pictures are not nearly as good as yours." And indeed, Wilson's pictures do lack animation. They're posed in stiff, conventional positions and placed unimaginatively on the page with little or no background. So, Audubon didn't buy a copy. Nonetheless, the 2 ornithologists, who were later to be seen by the outside world as bitter rivals, spent a very happy day together talking about birds, comparing one another's drawings, and it seems the following day they went off to hunt birds along the Ohio. But the meeting had put new ideas into his head. His paintings were improving all the time. Maybe he too, somehow, could make a living from them. His partners lost patience with him, and Audubon himself became bankrupt. Now he devoted himself entirely to his birds and to painting. And to earn some money from it, he gave lessons in drawing. One local lad, 18-year-old Joseph Mason, proved so talented that soon he was painting the plants and backgrounds for his master's birds. In 1820, Audubon decided to make a major expedition to find yet more species. Leaving Lucy and his children behind, he and Joseph Mason set off down the Ohio. They travelled on the flatboats that plied up and down the great river carrying cargo. It was a rough, wild and carefree life that 20 years later was to be immortalized in the stories of Mark Twain and paintings such as these by George Caleb Bingham. Audubon and Mason earned their passages by providing meat and fish. Audubon shot the birds and painted their portraits. Then young Joseph took them from him, plucked and cooked them, and everyone ate them. And doubtless, after the meal, Audubon, who was an accomplished fiddler, would entertain them all with music. For Audubon, now nearly 40, these were, one senses, the happiest years of his life. They had encounters with trappers and tribal Indians, redskins he called them. They made dangerous passages down rapids and waterfalls, and they met many other adventures that he would relate with great effect in later years. But above all, there were the birds, swarming in great numbers in the swamps and along the riverbanks, as they still do in parts today. Birds that provided him with endless subjects for his indefatigable brush. Not only did he draw them, but he noted in his journals in meticulous detail their habits and their behavior, how and where they nested, and also, in a matter-of-fact way, a practical detail that was of considerable interest to them all at the time, what they tasted like.
Snow geese are thought good eating when young and fat, but the old gander are tough and stringy. Those that are procured along the seashore, as they feed on shellfish, fry, and marine plants, have a rank taste which, however suited to the palate of the epicure, I never could relish.
They travelled the length of the Ohio, past Cave in Rock, a one-time haunt of river pirates, and onwards down the Mississippi. At New Madrid, he was delighted to bring down a bald eagle with one shot at a range of 150 yards, and then spent the next 4 days drawing a portrait of it eating a headless Canada goose. Eventually, he and Mason, after more than a year of wandering, reached the delta country of the Mississippi, where alligators lay among the swamp cypresses, and still more species of birds were to be found. For someone who was to become the patron saint of conservation, he hunted with extraordinary and unbecoming relish. He reckoned that a day in which he shot less than 100 birds was a poor one. On one occasion, he encountered a great flock of pelicans.
They were seated in comfortable harmony, as near each other as the strength of the boughs would allow. I waded to the shore under cover of the rushes along it, saw the pelicans fast asleep, examined their countenances and deportment well and leisurely, and, after all, levelled and fired my piece, and dropped 2 of the finest specimens I ever saw. I really believe I would have shot 100 of these reverend sirs had not a mistake taken place in the reloading of my gun.
But such an attitude was commonplace at this time. What was not commonplace was the delight he found in the birds themselves, and that in this instance led him to produce one of the finest and most memorable of his designs.
The American egrets are much attached to their roosting places, to which they remove from their feeding grounds regularly about an hour before the last glimpse of day. And I cannot help expressing my disbelief in the vulgar notion of birds of this family usually feeding by night, as I have never observed them so doing, even in countries where they were most abundant.
Audubon's work was now fully assured and confident, but little good did it do him. Nobody was interested in buying these huge life-size drawings, such as this study of a snowy egret. Here in Louisiana, he encountered new and sensational birds that had strayed up from the tropics. He drew these scarlet ibis from specimens he bought from another collector. The red one is an adult, the grey one an immature. He himself only saw these splendid birds alive just once, and regarded them as great rarities. He became much more familiar with the anhinga, or snake bird, for although it too has its headquarters in the tropics, it's nonetheless common in the swamps of Louisiana. It gets its name not because it eats snakes, but because it swims so low in the water that it could easily be mistaken for a swimming snake. In fact, it eats fish. Audubon pictured it in the posture it habitually adopts when, after fishing, it sits drying itself with its wings outstretched. It gave him a good opportunity to show off his skill in portraying the texture and quality of feathers. The female is much less brilliantly coloured. Virtually destitute, Audubon and Mason were about to travel back to the Ohio when they arrived here at Bayou Sara on the Mississippi, the port of St. Francisville. They had been invited to visit Oakley, a cotton plantation that belonged to a Scotsman, James Pirrie, himself an accomplished painter. For $60 a month and full board and lodging for himself and Mason, Mrs. Pirrie, who was much taken with Audubon's talents and winning ways, gave him a job teaching music and dancing to her 16-year-old daughter, Eliza. He was also to instruct her in painting. The family paint box still survives. But more importantly, he was to have half his time free to paint birds. For 5 months, in the summer of 1821, he happily studied and painted the birds along Bayou Sara Creek and in the surrounding district. So enchanted was he with the richness of this countryside that he often called it the Happy Land. Joseph Mason was now more his partner than his apprentice. He specialized in painting the flamboyant flowers of the South, and the two artists combined to produce some of the best designs they'd created so far. Audubon began to interest Eliza in natural history. They made collections together as well as painting, and all seemed set for a long and fruitful stay. But Eliza seems to have become altogether too fond of her handsome tutor. At any rate, Mrs. Pirrie brought Audubon's employment to an abrupt end. So he and Joseph went on to New Orleans to try and find some other way of earning a living. The next 2 years, in the old towns of the Mississippi Delta, were particularly unhappy and unsettled for Audubon. He sent for Lucy, who came down with the children, and they lived in this small house. He earned a little by painting portraits for $25 a head, but it was Lucy who really supported the family, working as a nurse, a tutor, and eventually going up to Bayou Sara to take charge of a school. But he continued to add more bird paintings to his collection, and at last, in the autumn of 1823, he decided he had enough for a book of American birds to rival Alexander Wilson's. Leaving Lucy yet again, he set off by boat back up the Mississippi to find a publisher in the East. Philadelphia was one of the intellectual capitals of the United States, the obvious place for an aspiring author to go when seeking a publisher. Its Academy of Natural Sciences was the premier scientific institution in the country, and Audubon persuaded them to mount an exhibition of his drawings. But they were not well received. Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology had been engraved, printed and published here, and at the time of Audubon's visit, a sequel to it with plates of new and hitherto undescribed species of bird were in preparation. Many people in the Academy, including in particular George Ord, saw in Audubon's work a potential competitor. Audubon, for his part, was openly and very tactlessly critical of the plates for the Wilson sequel. He said they showed birds as though sitting for their portraits, instead of as with their own lively ways when seeking their natural food and their pleasure. That led to a furious row with George Ord and a feud that was to last a lifetime. At any rate, Audubon saw no chance of getting help for his work here in Philadelphia, so he returned to Bayou Sara, said goodbye to Lucy, relieved her of most of her savings, and set sail for England to try his luck there. On the 21st of July, 1826, he landed in Liverpool. The city was then the second most prosperous in Britain after London, a major port for the transatlantic trade from America. Audubon, with a typically grand and extravagant gesture, celebrated his arrival by buying 2 splendid gold watches, complete with chains and seals. One he would keep for himself, the other he planned to take back as a present for Lucy. His drawings were put on display at the Liverpool Royal Institution and were an immediate sensation. People flocked to see them, and the exhibition, planned for 3 days, had to be extended to 5 weeks. The exhibition had been arranged by Richard Rathbone, one of a family of prosperous cotton merchants to whom Audubon had a letter of introduction. The Rathbone family lived in Greenbank, an elegant house outside the city, and they invited Audubon to stay with them there. The ladies of the family, young and old, and particularly Hannah, the daughter, were much taken by the romantic woodsman with his long shoulder-length chestnut hair. And for Hannah he painted the portrait of an English bird, a robin, on the back of which he wrote,
"It was my greatest wish to have had affixed on the face of this drawing my real thoughts of the amiable lady for whom I made it in poetry divine. But an injunction from Hannah Rathbone against the wish of my heart has put an end to it."
To express his gratitude to the Royal Institution, he painted in oils, within 24 hours, a gigantic version nearly 6 feet high of his portrait of the wild American turkey cock. Mrs. Rathbone asked him for a miniature version of it. A little mystified, Audubon provided it, and was duly presented a few days later with a seal engraved with his design and the words, "America, my country." From there he went north to Edinburgh by stagecoach. No one in Liverpool had been able to help him with publishing his drawings, but Edinburgh had many notable printers and publishing houses. After a slow start, he once again became the talk of the town. His drawings were exhibited at the Edinburgh Royal Institution. He was received by the great novelist Sir Walter Scott at his Edinburgh house, who pronounced the drawings as being of the finest order. But he was somewhat daunted by the formalities of fashionable parties, and described himself as standing as motionless as a heron and wishing he was back in the bayou. His portrait was painted by John Syme, showing him as he must have appeared during his adventures on the American frontier, which he related with such bravura, in a coat of wolfskin, ready for anything. He was even the subject of caricature, a sure measure of his success, if not notoriety. And here at last he met someone who would publish his drawings, William Lizars. The process by which drawings such as Audubon's were reproduced in the early 19th century was engraving. A sheet of metal, usually copper, was first covered with wax. Then the design of the original drawing is copied onto it, using a needle scratching through the wax to expose the metal. The plate is then placed in a bath of acid, which bites into the exposed metal, so etching a line. In those places where the engraver wishes to produce a tone, a porous layer of granulated resin is dropped onto the plate and fused to it by gentle heating before being etched again. The plate is copper, but at this stage it may be coated with nickel to protect it. Next, it is inked. Then wiped so that the ink remains only in the engraved lines. And then it's put in the press. And this was the first of Audubon's designs to be printed, the great American turkey cock. The colours are then added by hand. Audubon's plan was to publish the plates in groups of 5, each starting with a superb full plate. So the magnificent turkey was followed by a slightly smaller plate of yellow-billed cuckoos among pawpaws, an excellent example of Audubon's flair for showing birds in action, though, to tell the truth, yellow-billed cuckoos don't often eat swallowtail butterflies. Then 3 smaller plates, the prothonotary warbler, a bird he had drawn in the swamps of Louisiana, and the purple finch, which lives in the dark coniferous forests of the north. And lastly, a bird he called Bonaparte's flycatcher, which we know today as the Canada warbler. So, at last, the printing of the Great Bird Book had started, and the first part got rave reviews. William Swainson, one of the most distinguished of the English ornithologists, considered that they had brought something quite new to the portrayal of birds.
If the passions of the brute creation can be traced in their physiognomy, and no doubt they can, we can discern as much of the mild dignity of the great American patriot in this his emblem as can well be expressed in the head of a bird.
Audubon had discovered that if his publication was described as a book, he would be compelled by law to present a copy of it free, gratis and for nothing to each of the copyright libraries in Britain. Since he was charging £1,000 for a complete set, that represented a very considerable expenditure indeed. So he decided to issue the plates separately, and then to publish the text in a much smaller and cheaper book, which he called the Ornithological Biography. A young Scottish naturalist, William McGillivray, helped him to convert his quaint English into more conventional prose, but his descriptions remain vivid and wholly idiosyncratic. He writes how one August evening, on the banks of the Mohawk River, just as he had made camp and was preparing to sleep, he encountered the rose-breasted grosbeak.
Having thanked the Creator of all for his never-failing mercy, I closed my eyes and was passing away into the world of dreaming existence, when suddenly there burst on my soul the serenade of the rose-breasted bird. So rich, so mellow, so loud in the stillness of the night, that sleep fled from my eyelids. Never did I enjoy music more. It thrilled through my heart and surrounded me with an atmosphere of bliss. One might easily have imagined that even the owl, charmed by such delightful music, remained reverently silent. Long after the sounds ceased did I enjoy them, and when all had again become still, I stretched out my wearied limbs and gave myself up to the luxury of repose.
This ecstasy of delight in birds led him to plead, hunter though he had been and remained, for the preservation and protection of them.
The crow devours myriads of grubs every day of the year that might lay waste to the farmer's fields. It destroyed quadrupeds innumerable, every one of which is an enemy to his poultry and his flocks. Why then should the farmer be so ungrateful when he sees such services rendered to him by a providential friend as to persecute that friend even to the death? Unless he plead ignorance, surely he ought to be found guilty at the bar of common sense. When I know by experience the generosity of the people, I cannot but wish that they would reflect a little and become more indulgent toward our poor, humble, harmless, and even most serviceable bird, the crow.
He realized, with a foresight that was given to very few 150 years ago, that the marvelous assemblages of birds that were commonplace in the America of his time were not indestructible. The passenger pigeon, then, was probably the most numerous bird on earth. Flocks, millions strong, took several days to fly by and blotted out the sun, and they were slaughtered in millions. but Audubon warned that even this bird could be reduced in number if the steady clearing of the North American forests continued. It did continue, and the last living passenger pigeon died on September the 1st, 1914. The Carolina parakeet was also so abundant it was regarded as a pest. Hordes of them descended on orchards and wheat fields. Audubon drew it with affection and described how it was being killed in huge numbers. This bird, too, is now extinct. The pleasure he found in the movements of living birds that he captured so well in his pictures, he also described most engagingly in words.
Light as a sylph, the Arctic tern dances through the air above and around you. The Graces, one might imagine, had taught it to perform those beautiful gambols which you see it display the moment you approach the spot which it has chosen for its nest. Over many a league of ocean it has passed, regardless of the dangers and difficulties that might deter a more considerable traveller. Now, over some solitary green isle, a creek, or an extensive bay it sweeps. Now, over the expanse of the boundless sea, at length it has reached the distant regions of the north, and amidst the floating icebergs stoops to pick up a shrimp. It betakes itself to the borders of a lonely sandbank or low rocky island. There, side by side, the males and the females alight and congratulate each other on the happy termination of their long journey.
Sometimes he found what he believed to be a new species, though none today is accepted as being more than a local variant. He pictured on this plate a whole group of slightly different woodpeckers. One of them, in fact a local race of the hairy woodpecker, he named Maria's woodpecker, after one of the many ladies whose help he so often recruited. That led his old enemy, George Ord, back in Philadelphia, to write in the margin of the ornithological biography, "It is a fortunate circumstance for the credit of American ornithology that the author of the Birds of America had not more frequent opportunities of paying such compliments, or we should have had an introduction to all the old maids of his acquaintance with their pretty names applied to peckers, cocks, and snipes." While work on the plates continued, Audubon returned to America to look for new birds to make his book as complete as possible. He travelled north to Labrador and Nova Scotia, and there he saw spectacular colonies of seabirds.
As we approached Great Gannet Rock, I imagined that the atmosphere around was filled with snowflakes, but on turning to the pilot, who smiled at my simplicity, I was assured that nothing was in sight but the gannets and their island home. I rubbed my eyes, took up my glass, and saw that the strange dimness of the air before us was caused by innumerable birds, whose white bodies and black-tipped pinions produced a blended tint of light grey. When we had advanced to within half a mile, this magnificent veil of floating gannets was easily seen, now shooting upwards as if intent on reaching the sky, then descending as if to join the feathered masses below, and again diverging towards either side and sweeping over the surface of the ocean.
But sometimes his pen got a little carried away.
I observed with my glass the regularity of the lines of nests, and saw many of the birds digging the earth with their strong bills.
To which George Ord in Philadelphia responded by writing acidly in the margin of his copy, "How he could overlook an elevation of 400 feet from the deck of so small a vessel is a mystery I cannot explain. His glass must have possessed extraordinary powers indeed." But his eye certainly remained as acute, and his hand as skilful as ever, as he produced yet more paintings of these northern birds and sent them back to his publishers for engraving. But now, even in England, criticisms were being voiced. This dramatic plate of a rattlesnake attacking a mockingbird became the subject of a ferocious quarrel. Charles Waterton, a Yorkshire naturalist famous for his explorations in South America, was outraged.
Audubon's mistakes in drawing and gross exaggerations and errors in ornithology surpass anything I ever saw. Just cast your eye for a moment over the plate of the rattlesnake and mockingbirds. Swainson is quite in raptures with this plate. The eyes of the rattlesnake are drawn as though starting from the socket. This is most unnatural and can only arise from disease or a blow. The snake, as drawn by Audubon, would suit to a nicety a signpost for St. George and the Dragon. Audubon professes to have made rattlesnakes his study for years. Still, such is his ignorance of poisonous snakes that he has absolutely drawn the fangs of his snake with the points turning upwards instead of downwards. Now I will forfeit my existence if any man can produce to me the fang of a poisonous snake with the point turning upwards. Swainson and Audubon ought both to be whipped for this business, the one for drawing, the other for passing off such a distorted exhibition.
But in fact, Audubon was right on both points. Because of his insistence that every bird should be shown life-size, and because the double elephant size was the biggest sheet that paper makers produced at this time, his compositions were sometimes a little cramped. The turkey cock seldom looks over his shoulder in quite this way, and the great white heron never takes up this odd posture. And even in such a strange attitude as this, the whooping crane only just fits onto the paper. Sometimes, in order to show the birds from several angles, he crowded his plates unnaturally. Hummingbirds are so aggressive they seldom tolerate the close presence of another, let alone 9, as there are here. But no one could deny the magnificence of Audubon's designs. His genius for composition led him to transform what were intended originally to be straightforward, scientifically accurate ornithological illustrations into spectacular and memorable pictures. Must be given to his helpers. Joseph Mason was only the first. After his departure, George Lehmann, a young Swiss artist whom Audubon had met in Pittsburgh, provided charming vignettes of 19th century America for the backgrounds. George Ward criticised the plates on the grounds that there was so much background that sometimes one could hardly see the birds. Today, this combination of bird and background seems one of the plate's chief beauties. Maria Martin, the lady for whom he had named the woodpecker, painted the flowers for his birds to perch amongst and the insects for them to chase. She was the sister-in-law of an ornithological friend, John Bachman, after whom he named this little warbler. There had been some difficulties with the engraving and the printing of the plates. Lizard's colourists in Edinburgh had gone on strike over pay after the first few plates, and the work was now being done in London by Robert Havell, who was himself an accomplished painter, and his father, who handled the printing. The work of tracing, transferring, and engraving the design on the plate demanded great skill, and could, when well done, contribute much to the beauty of the finished print. But Havell frequently changed the designs. Audubon provided this drawing of a barred owl with wings outstretched in a threatening pose, but it seems to have taken alarm at nothing. Havell found a separate study that Audubon had made of a squirrel and combined the two, so that on the finished plate the owl has something to pounce on, which accounts for the fact that the squirrel, judging from its expression, seems blissfully unaware of the owl's existence. Audubon also changed his mind. He redrew his original watercolour of the bald eagle with its decapitated Canada goose, and gave it instead a catfish, which he thought looked less bloodthirsty and made it more acceptable to his subscribers. But Audubon kept a sharp eye on the quality of the plates as they appeared. The black and white prints were sent to him, and he himself coloured some of them to provide a pattern for colourists working in Havell's studio. He also bombarded his engraver with letters of complaint.
I saw this day several plates no more like my drawing than a chimney sweep is to your beautiful wife.
He would doubtless be delighted by what is happening to his plates today in a studio in London. To mark the bicentenary of his birth, the American Museum of Natural History has arranged for 6 of those that still survive to be printed once more. Even greater care is being taken over their colouring. Coloured inks are being applied to the plate itself, a technique that was probably too expensive for the original edition, but which enables the qualities of the engraving to be conveyed to the print with even greater delicacy. Several versions are tried out before a pattern of inking is decided upon. Odd marks and scratches that have appeared on the plates in the last 150 years are being carefully reamed and polished away. The majority of the original plates were sent for scrap, and these particular ones were only saved after being snatched back from a metal dealer's yard. The final inking is meticulously planned using a gaudy chart which shows exactly where each colour should go.
It's only just an etched line, so we could do that in a dark green and treat it, as I said, very much like the male. That will all just have to be hand-coloured. There's no aqua tint or anything on there.
It would have to be lighter down in the corner, because it's quite...
Yeah, it's quite dark down there, but there's not an awful lot of sort of line work there, is there? So we can probably just try to lose that, maybe. But as you say, put a lighter colour in there. Moving on to the male bird, I think we might find a lot of these colours we actually want will come out naturally due to the different engraving.
We can get a great deal of that effect just by modelling it in the brush.
Yes, and it would be nice too if you can get some of these shadows in and then sort of pull it out, so it gives it some sort of three-dimensional look instead of just a sort of flat look of one colour.
So, a few more impressions of Audubon's magnificent birds are now appearing. Even though many colours in this edition have been applied to the plate, hand colouring is still required. One print, approved by the American Museum of Natural History, with regard both to the bird itself and Audubon's originals, serves as the model for colouring the whole edition. Havell produced less than 200 sets of the plates, and Audubon's original accounts show how extraordinarily expensive the process was even in the 19th century. The cost of the edition was £28,910, 13 shillings and 7pence halfpenny. In gratitude for all the work, he presented Havell with a silver beaker. Audubon at last was becoming wealthy. He bought himself a whole set of solid silver cutlery. He gave Lucy a cross of amethyst to set alongside the simple earrings and necklace of woven hair that he had made and given her when they were first engaged. On the 16th of June, 1838, the printing of the last group of plates was completed. They were headed by this superb portrait of the American flamingo. It was the end of 12 years' exhausting work by Audubon and his printers. 435 marvellous plates illustrating 497 different species of American birds. A few months later, the fifth and final volume of the Ornithological Biography was published in Edinburgh. Audubon was now 54 years old, prematurely aged, tired out by his great task. But when he returned finally to America, he came almost as a hero. Honours and medals were heaped upon him. There he started work on another huge project, the mammals, or viviparous quadrupeds as he termed them, of America. His son John, already a very competent draftsman who had done some work on the birds, drew many of the plates, and the text was tackled by his old Carolina friend, John Bachman. But long before it was completed, the old man gave up the work. He died on the 27th of January, 1851. His monument is this, the 4 volumes of the Birds of America. Many of the birds that he illustrated in it, the passenger pigeon, the Carolina parakeet, and the great auk, are extinct. And now it seems almost certain that this bird too, the ivory-billed woodpecker that he shows in such vigorous, lively action, at work on a branch with bits of bark flying in all directions, is extinct as well. So, in an all too literal sense, it's their monument as well. Audubon's great achievement was to combine in these magnificent plates scientific accuracy, a representation of the living, breathing bird, and the creation of dramatic design. Surely no country has a more magnificent and monumental foundation for its natural history than that which John James Audubon gave to North America in his Double Elephant Folio.
Next on BBC4, the birth of the tabloid newspaper. Then, we're live at this year's Samuel Johnson Prize for Non-Fiction, and later, the subtle art of communication in the life of birds at 11.